Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. And today's contract tip, in continuing on with the changes to the Georgia Association of Realtors, or GAR contracts, we are going to cover the assignment of the purchase and sale agreement. And this is GAR form F279. So let's get into it. This is not a full-blown video on assigning the rights to the purchase and sale agreement. I am going to do a whole nother video on that because there are a lot of intricacies and contract issues that you need to consider if you are working with the assignor or the investor or the assignee, the end person buying the house or that will live the house. But the purpose of today's video is just to go over the changes that the Georgia Association of Realtors made on this agreement. Again, it is form F279. So let me show you what it actually looks like, and we will cover this brief video tip on this document. So this is called Assignment of Purchase and Sale Agreement Rights. And basically what they did is they have reworded it and updated it to try and make it a little bit easier to understand. And as you will notice, the signatures just have the assignee and the assignor. And as I go through it, you will notice nowhere does the actual seller of the property sign this document. This is just an agreement between the assignee and the assignor. So let me go through it just a little bit, try to make it a little bit easier to understand. And then, as I said, stay tuned for a full-blown video just on assignment in and of itself and how that works with the whole purchase and sale agreement and the seller's involvement. But today I'm just going to go over the changes to this form. So in 2022, nothing has changed. You still fill out the assignment and the assignment agreement. You enter in the date of that, and the original, you fill in the name right here of the original buyer. We're going to call that person buyer A. Buyer A, or the assignor, is the party that actually is the buyer on a purchase and sale agreement with a seller. And then you have buyer B, or new buyer, who is the assignee. For all practicality purposes, for the purposes of this discussion, what we generally see in practice is you have a seller, then you have an assignor, which is typically an investor that writes a contract, goes binding with the seller, but they have no intention of ever living in that house. They then assign their rights or sell their rights to the contract to the assignee, or buyer B, who will actually occupy the home. And then it says the assignor, who is buyer A, enters into a certain purchase and sale agreement with the binding agreement data. So you reference the binding agreement data of the contract, the property address, and it says a copy of said agreement is attached as an exhibit. So the assignee, the end buyer who will live in the property, does get a copy of the actual purchase and sale agreement, because they are in essence buying that purchase and sale agreement from buyer A to actually live in the house the seller is selling. And then you go on, and it said you talk about assignment. Assignor does hereby sell, assign, set over, or transfer the assignee all the assignor's rights, and then there's a price. So in essence, the investor or assignor or buyer A is selling their position in this binding contract with a seller to the assignee, and they can sell it for whatever price they negotiate with the assignee or buyer B. This price has nothing to do with the purchase price that the seller is going to get. This is just the cost of selling their position as the binding buyer in the contract. And then it talks about if it's in cash or the equivalent. And then it talks about the acceptance of the assignment, and the assignee or buyer B, or the person that's going to end up occupying the property, agrees that the assignee shall stand in place of the assignor with respect to the assignor's rights and obligations under the agreement, and agrees to indemnify and hold harmless the assignor from lawsuits, damages, so forth, and seller of the seller or the broker against the assignor. Then it goes on to say that whereas the assigner and the assignee warrant and represent, they have the power and authority to enter into this agreement. The assignor warrants that they have the right to enter into this agreement. In other words, the investor or buyer A does have a binding contract with a seller that they do have the authority or the right to sell their position, sell the contract, assign the contract to the assignee. And that is very important because the GAR purchase and sale agreement in and of itself is not assignable. You must have the seller's position and permission. And that is all spelled out in the GAR purchase and sale agreement under paragraph C4E. This paragraph right here, where it's under the subheading of entire agreement modification and assignment. And at the very end, it does state this agreement may not be assigned by the buyer except with written approval of the seller, and that may be withheld for any reason or no reason. Any assignee shall fulfill all the terms and conditions of this agreement. So the assignor or the investor buyer must have the seller's permission to assign the contract in order to even enter into this agreement. And that's what that references. And I'll get to a brand new 2022 special stipulation that you need to include in the contract. And then it goes on to say that this assignment agreement right here, this document right here is the sole and entire agreement, and there's no other representations or inducements that are not spelled out and agreed to in writing on this document. Now, here is the interesting part. And in the previous versions of this form, it was very confusing regarding commission. Who got paid what commission when? So if there is typically, well, I'm not gonna say typically, but a lot of times there is a broker that represents the seller. That broker has nothing to do with this agreement. Then there is another broker that represents the assignor / investor / buyer A. Now, if that investor, buyer A, that broker finds the end buyer or buyer B who's actually going to occupy the home, and there's no other broker involved, then it's pretty clear cut that broker will get paid the buy side commission with respect to the entire purchase and sale agreement. However, it gets a bit complicated when you have a broker that represents the seller, you have a broker that represents the investor / buyer A / assignor, and then that person finds an end buyer or assignee or buyer B who is actually going to live in the property, and they have their own broker. Then who gets paid what? Because the contract, the binding contract, is between the investor, buyer A, and the seller. There's no agreement between a third broker representing the assignee. So that's where this paragraph becomes very important. And it talks about assignment commission. This is just commission on this agreement, not the purchase and sale agreement. It says, in the event that a licensed real estate broker other than the seller's broker or buyer's broker, that the seller's broker is the one who represents the seller in the purchase and sale agreement, the buyer's broker, with reference to this, is the broker that represents the buyer A, investor, assignor. If there is another broker other than those two brokers, who is the procuring cause of the assignment, in other words, the end buyer, buyer B, assignee, who's going to live in the property, if they have their own broker and they're the procuring cause of the assignment of the purchase and sale agreement from the assignor to the assignee, then this is how the commissions work. In consideration of the payment of the assignee to the broker representing buyer number 1 on the contract with the seller. That is now the assignor's broker. So the assignee pays the assignor's broker, a licensed real estate broker and buyer's broker under the purchase and sale agreement, the amount of, and you fill in the blank, you negotiate the commission for the assignment, is in full satisfaction of commission payable to assignor's broker under the purchase and sale agreement. The assignor's broker does hereby waive and assign all the rights of the buyer's broker under the purchase and sale agreement. So now the broker representing the investor is now out of it. Now the broker who, if there's a third broker involved, who represents the assignee, the end buyer that's going to buy the property, they now become they take over the position of the broker on the buy side with the seller. So the broker representing buyer number 2 who will end up in the property, gets the commission with respect to the purchase and sale agreement. Then we have to talk about earnest money. And it says earnest money deposited by the assignor, the middleman, the investor, shall be applied to the purchase price. In the event the agreement is terminated without penalty, the earnest money shall be returned to the assignee. So again, it gets a little complicated. I just want to go over a couple of things. They did, believe it or not, they did clarify this commission section as far as which broker is representing which party and identifying if there is a third broker involved. Additionally, at the bottom, it does have a place, it has contact information for the assignee and the assignee's broker, and then it is just signed by the 2 brokers representing the 2 buyers, buyer A and buyer B. A couple of things. Remember, we said that the GAR purchase and sale agreement is not assignable without the seller's written permission. So you agents working with buyers who are investors who look to go under contract with a seller, knowing full good and well they are going to assign their contract to an end buyer, you must include this brand new special stipulation. It is special stipulation 611 that GAR has put out in 2022. And how it reads, it's this bottom one right here, special stip 611. Seller consents to assignment of purchase and sale agreement. The seller consents to the buyer assigning this agreement to another buyer / assignee and having assignee become the buyer thereunder. So again, stay tuned for a little bit further, and then there's an acceptance date of this agreement between the 2 buyers. Again, it is GAR form F279. It is called Assignment of Purchase and Sale Agreement Rights. And as I said, stay tuned for a further, more in-depth explanation of how this actually works in practice. Where does the seller get involved? What about inspections? What about due diligence period? What about financing contingencies, other contingencies, so forth and so on? We will get into all of that in another video. I just wanted to touch on the changes to the actual forms that GAR made for 2022, as well as address that new special stipulation 611. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks. Please check out the other videos that I have done on the changes to the 2022 Georgia Association of Realtors contract package. We are still teaching 3-hour continuing education classes on this topic, and I'll link the calendar below. If you go to www.registerforreclasses.com, click on a geographic area, and you will see those classes. But I'll put some links below to some other videos. And I think that's it for this one. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.